General Adaptation Syndrome. In a previous video, we were listening to Walter Cannon's theory about acute stress response, and he talked about fight or flight. Well, Hans Selye took fight or flight and used that in a new syndrome that he put together. Hans Selye is actually known as the father of stress research. And he's a Canadian, and he's done a lot of his work out of McGill University. But he really took a look at how the body handles stress. And as you can see by this image, it's not the stress that kills us, it's our reaction to it. And that's really key, because stress can kill us. We don't often think about it's how we handle it. We have to learn how to cope with it. And when I say cope with stress, I'm looking at ways that are probably more healthy. Very often we find ways to deal with stress that are probably not that great for us in the long term. They might help the stress in the short term, but in the long term they are more of a hindrance. So when we take a look at Hans Selye, as I mentioned, he is the father of stress research. He outlined something called the General Adaptation Syndrome, and it's 3 biological phases in the body. And it really is the response to that issue called fight or flight. And fight or flight, really, if we look at these 3, the alarm stage, the stage of resistance, and the stage of exhaustion, fight or flight comes right into the alarm stage. So Selye picked up where Walter Cannon ended his research. The General Adaptation Syndrome, as I said, looks at the 3 levels. In the first one, we have the alarm stage, and the picture dictates or shows that we're at a social party, social interaction, but the individual is starting to have some social anxiety. This is when the body starts to show some of those reactions where the breathing might increase, the body might start to sweat, your heart might start pumping a little faster, you might have sweaty palms, you might feel your mouth getting dry. These are all the signs that you're starting to have to deal with fight or flight. When we move into the second stage, it really takes a look at the resistance. Do you stay or do you go? Because if you stay, it's going to get worse. If you go, you're going to be able to come back to this homeostasis and back to a normal state of being. Selye looked at when people don't deal with stress properly and the resistance phase goes on, that the third stage is called exhaustion. And you can kind of see by the image what happens. So again, fight or flight in the alarm stage, it's the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system are really activated, and these things are working at the same time. And it's almost like an alarm clock is going off or a bell is going off. Something is saying to you, danger, danger, we need to do something about it. Very often what people do is they just move on to this stage called resistance. The body wants to get back into balance, but the individual isn't leaving. The stress is persisting. The body has to continually try to adapt to deal with this resistance, and it stays in a steady state of arousal, meaning the heart rate is high, the blood pressure is high, the muscles are activated, the liver is working overtime, the adrenal glands are working overtime. And when this happens over and over again, there's little or no time for recovery, and the individual will probably move into this stage called exhaustion. Now, you've heard people say, I'm exhausted. I'm so exhausted. Well, generally, they're not in the exhaustion stage of stress response. They're just tired. They haven't been getting enough sleep, which we know is important, but it's very different than this stage, because this stage is that the resistance is gone. The body cannot get back to homeostasis. We often hear the term burnout. And at this stage, it is really hazardous to our health, because we think about the damage that happens at the cell level. Thinking and memory is impaired, and there's more of a tendency here towards anxiety and depression. And very often we think about stress and we think about the human body that there's a term out there now called inflammation. And when people are highly stressed long term, it leads to inflammation in the body. And we now know that inflammation can be linked to impaired immunity, it can be linked to diabetes, it can be linked to Alzheimer's, all of these things. It's not just from being stressed because you've got an exam coming up at the end of the term. This is long-term stress that has been allowed to go on and on and on. And people generally think that they can just put their head down, the old term, your nose to the grindstone, and keep working through it. But the human body is not meant for this. We need to get back to a state of homeostasis.